Hello again, students. In this video we're going to talk about constructing moral arguments, and in particular we're going to talk about constructing principled moral arguments. So this is probably going to be the most common kind of moral argument we're going to make, so it'll be useful to learn how to do this. Alright, so we're going to look at constructing principled moral arguments. Let's look at an example. Premise 1 says lying deceives people. Premise 2 says if an act deceives people, then it's morally wrong. What can we conclude from these two claims? If you said lying is morally wrong, then you're right on. You got the right answer. So that's the conclusion. So therefore, lying is morally wrong. This kind of argument is what I'm going to call a principled argument, because it relies on the truth of a general moral principle. It has the following structure. Premise 1 of this argument says that there's some act, or act type A, that has some empirical property, E. So I'll use A to refer to acts, I'll use E to refer to empirical properties. What's an empirical property, you ask? I'm just going to use that to refer to any property that's not a moral property. So it might be more accurate to describe it as like a descriptive property or something, but let's not get too hung up on that. The main thing is, whatever this property is, it's the kind of thing that you can sort of like go out into the world and find as tangible, something you could sort of use science to figure out. Lying, right, deceives people. That's not a sort of moral property, the fact that it's deceptive. That's just sort of empirical property, which is to say lying leads people to have false beliefs. We could just test that out. We could lie to some people, find out if they have false beliefs. So that's that. Premise 2 has this structure. It says, it starts out with this claim: if an act, and then has that empirical property, E, that I just mentioned, right, then it has some moral property. So this is the moral principle. It's a general principle. Note, it says if an act, any act, has that empirical property, then it has some moral property. All our principled arguments are going to have a premise like this. If any act has some empirical property, then it's got some moral property. You know, sometimes an argument might even say if an act has some moral property A, then it has this other moral property B. But most of the arguments will look like this. If an act has some empirical property, then it's got some moral property. If we've got those two premises, we can conclude that act, or act type A, has the moral property mentioned in premise 2. So let's take a look at the argument we looked at before, right? Smoking cigarettes, I guess we looked at it in a previous video. Smoking cigarettes makes you look cool. If an act makes you look cool, then you should do it. Therefore, you should smoke cigarettes. Now this argument's a little bit different, right? The second premise isn't saying, therefore, the act has some moral property, but it is kind of saying that it has a moral property. It has this slightly different property, the property of should be done, something like that. And then the conclusion, gets us, well, therefore you should, and then insert act next. So this argument, again, it's a principled argument. It relies on the truth of a general moral principle. It's got the same structure. Some act has this empirical property. It makes you look cool. If acts have that empirical property, then they have a moral property, should be done. Therefore, the act smoking cigarettes should be done. Or, I've just kind of like flipped the language here a little bit. You should do it, which is the act. Therefore, you should put the act there. Again, this is a subtle difference. I don't want to make too big of a deal about it. Usually, we can sort of just have a good feel for these things. But if you want to, we want to be careful that we're not changing the language too much from one premise to another. Basically what we want to say is like, here's A, we want to keep that consistent. Here's E, we want to keep that consistent. Therefore, moral property, make sure that moral property shows up in the conclusion, and then sort of, is it smoking cigarettes is something you should do? If we put that, then here, then the act is something you should do it, therefore you should smoke cigarettes. Anyway, hopefully that's clear enough. So all these arguments have this basically same structure. We're going to learn to symbolize these like so. So premise 1, an act has property E. I'm just going to say A arrow E. What that arrow is sort of indicating is that anything that's A is going to have property E. A guarantees E. Premise 2 says E guarantees M. So anything that has property E is going to have property M. And when we get those two premises like that, we can conclude that, therefore, whatever has A has M. An act A or of type A has property M. So this is what we call just like the transitive property. So if Alex is taller than Ethan and Ethan is taller than Matt, then Alex is taller than Matt. It's sort of just a common relationship. And we might show it like this. So premise 1, we have A arrow E. Premise 2 says E arrow M. And if we know that A stands in this arrow relationship to E, E stands in that same relationship to M, then A must stand in that relationship to M as a whole. So we can sort of drop E out. Another thing to note here is that the order of the premises doesn't really matter. So we could start with premise 1 saying E arrow M. We could have, I've symbolized that here. We'd have premise 2 saying A arrow E, right? So we add A arrow E on, and the same thing happens, right? So the order of the premises doesn't matter. What is important is that these are both premises. If we have these two premises together, there's this middle term, A arrow E, E arrow M, then we can cut out the middleman and say conclusion. Therefore, A arrow M. So that's the important thing to note about these principled arguments. They have this structure, and we can use that structure to figure out how to argue for the views that we want to argue for. So let's talk about how to do this, how to construct an argument for yourself. So to start, I want to acknowledge that this can be tricky, right? It's not something you'll immediately know how to do and you'll be great. It might take some practice. Ideally, when we do this process, we want to start with a moral principle or an analogy, which we'll learn about next time. So whenever we're constructing moral arguments, we'd like to start with our principle or analogy, apply it to the case in question, and then arrive at our conclusion. So in a way, it'd be nice to have our premises first and use our premises to get to our conclusion. So maybe you have some general view about if an act hurts people, then it's wrong. So we have that general principle, and then we just looked for any act. We say, well, does it hurt people? If so, then we know that it's wrong. But this is hard to do with really tricky moral arguments. Oftentimes, what we end up doing is we find ourselves knowing what we think the conclusion should be. We don't really think about the arguments. We just think, oh no, I don't think you should smoke cigarettes, for example. And I say, well, why? And you're like, well, and then you're like, okay, I've got to come up with a reason. And you probably had a reason, right, that probably led you to think that conclusion. But it'd be nice if we were using those reasons to generate our arguments in the first place, rather than sort of coming up with them after the fact. Sometimes people call this we're rationalizing. We're coming up with a reason for concluding the thing we want to include. But for now, let's not worry too much about that. Let's say it's fine if we have our conclusion first, and just rationalizing will be acceptable. As I say, this isn't ideal, but we'll work with it for now. So in that case, what we want to do first is identify the conclusion. So if we're like, okay, I know I think this thing, so let's write that down. The next step is to figure out why we believe that conclusion. So for a principled argument, this often involves using introspection to just identify what it is about the act that gives it the moral property that we think it has. What is it about smoking, for example, that makes us think that you shouldn't do it? Or if you think you should smoke, right, what is it about smoking that makes us think that we should do it? The next step, once we've got our conclusion and we've got our one reason, our sort of main reason, right? I encourage students to think about that. Just put it in a sentence where, smoking is something you shouldn't do. And then the sentence would be, why is that? Well, because smoking does what? What is it about smoking that makes it the case that we shouldn't do it? So we take what we've got, we put it into standard form, and we symbolize it. And then we can figure out what the implicit premise is by looking at sort of the structure of a principled argument, right? It needs to have the sort of AE, EM, therefore AM structure. And so if we have two premises, we can figure out what's missing and write that thing in. Finally, we might want to strengthen our arguments by modifying their premises. So the thought here is like, maybe when I look at my argument and read through it, I'm like, you know what, I can make this stronger, I can make it better by changing the premises a little bit. I don't want to say too much about this here because we're not going to focus on it now. We'll focus on this a little bit more later. But the thing I do want to say is this, that our goal is to construct the strongest arguments that we can. But it's also important that our arguments do a relatively good job of reflecting our actual thinking. Like our arguments should really express the reasons why we think the things we think. If we don't do that, then we're arguing in what's called bad faith. And we're not really taking the discussion seriously. And this is a vice that's opposed to intellectual courage, right? We're not actually being courageous. We're hiding our actual reasons. It's also a vice opposed to intellectual honesty, right? It's a kind of dishonesty and pretending like we're arguing for something for one reason when in fact we're arguing for it for another. So we want our arguments, I guess this is just to say that we want our arguments to reflect our actual thinking on these matters. Okay, to practice, I want to look at this question, is recreational marijuana use morally permissible? I ask you to construct a valid principled argument for your view. So what you're going to do, maybe you want to pause the video, right? Take a chance to try and come up with an argument for your position, or try and give an argument for both sides, right? An argument for its permissibility, an argument against its permissibility. What does permissible mean, right? It just means it's okay. Is it okay to do it, morally speaking? It's as opposed to being obligatory, something you have to do, and wrong, something you have to not do. So again, if you want to try this out, and I would encourage you to do this, pause the video, give it a shot, come back and check and see if you are doing it right. Okay, so first steps might be just laying out, P1, premise 2, conclusion. But then, obviously, the first step in the step-by-step instructions, figure out what your conclusion is. I'm going to start out with an argument for why recreational marijuana use is morally permissible. So that's my conclusion. Action, recreational marijuana use has moral property M. It's morally permissible. All right. Next step is to figure out, why do I think that's true? What is it about recreational marijuana use that makes me think that it's permissible? And here I'm going to give it a shot. Here's a reason someone might give. Well, recreational marijuana use is fun and it doesn't harm anyone. Sounds like a pretty good reason to think that something's okay. Now, what we want to do, maybe we're like, okay, well, how do I finish my argument? Like, what other premise do I need to add? We need to add the moral principle. So what do we do at this point? We symbolize what we have. So we have premise 1, we have act, has empirical property E, recreational marijuana use has property, and then in some sense, the two properties. It's fun, so it's property F, if you want to say that, and it doesn't harm anyone. And property D does no harm. How would we symbolize a conclusion? Recreational marijuana use has property M, morally permissible, or moral property P, if we want to say, permissible. Okay, so I've got A arrow E as a premise, and I have a conclusion A arrow M. What's the missing premise? The missing premise is E arrow M. That's the premise I need to validly get from A to E, E to M. That gets me A arrow M. So that's the premise I need, and then I just need to turn that into a sentence. So remember, our principle will start out, if an act has property E, then it's got property M. So if an act is fun and doesn't harm anyone, then it's morally permissible. Boom. There's our argument. It's valid. Maybe we think we could improve the argument by modifying the premises. It's very fun, and it doesn't harm anyone in this certain way. And then maybe our second premise says, if an act's very fun and it doesn't harm anyone in this certain way, then it's permissible, or whatever. Right? But that's good for now. Now let's try an argument for the other conclusion, right? Recreational marijuana use is not permissible. It's not okay to do it. What could be a reason for that? Think about it. Why might we think that recreational marijuana use is not morally permissible? Why I think it's morally wrong? Here's a reason. Recreational marijuana use hinders one's ability to think rationally. So we've got our conclusion, we've got a premise, we want to symbolize what we have. A to E as a premise, conclusion's A to M. What am I missing? I'm missing a premise again that says E arrow M, so I need to fill that in. Got E arrow M. What's that going to be? It's going to start, if an act has property E, hinders one's ability to think rationally, then property M, then it's not morally permissible. So if an act hinders one's ability to think rationally, then it's not morally permissible. Great, excellent. That is our argument, and it's valid. Right? If we want to tweak the premises a little bit, make it stronger, we can do that. But this is good for us for now. Now, I think oftentimes when we make arguments, we're going to start with a conclusion, and it's easiest maybe to come up with this premise one, the sort of empirical property that the act has that makes it have the moral property. But sometimes people just think of it and they're going to come up with premise 2 first. They're going to start with why I think recreational marijuana use is not permissible. Well, because if acts hinder one's ability to think rationally, then they're not permissible. Or because hindering one's ability to think rationally is not permissible. Something like that. Then it's like, okay, well, I've got this empirical property. I've got a general premise already. Empirical property E has moral property M, and I'm going to need to add in premise 1. So basically, what you're going to do is you're going to look at what you've got, figure out what you're missing, and add that in. Again, this will take practice to get good at, but with practice, we'll get better. Okay, that's the end of this video on constructing principled arguments. Next video will be on constructing analogical arguments. Analogical arguments are going to be maybe in a way a bit harder to construct, but they are also a bit more powerful if we are able to construct them. So that's what we'll be looking at next time.